Okay.
Dedicated
Okay, so this
share.
is dedicated for Shlomo, for the Cholim Klal Israel, and for the protection of the Jews and other good people in the Ukraine, and a speedy end to the conflict.
Amen.
Okay, so continuing here on the theme. Okay, we're going to do something new. Let's talk about. Okay, here we go. If it's talking about leasing a property, in the event that one leased a property in prohibited circumstances, that would be if revenue is generated on Shabbos or it's open on Shabbos. Some say that he may nevertheless receive the revenue, and this is according to the Beit Yosef. Others say that he may not, and that is the halacha. Okay, some poskim allow a bathhouse to be leased in other circumstances as well. If the bathhouse is in a separate courtyard from the owner's house, the owner may lease it to a non-Jew, even if others bathe there. In this case, people are not likely to know the owner's identity. Okay, so that's a very important fact. Only the bathhouse's immediate neighbors would likely know who the owner is, and would probably realize that it is leased to a non-Jew who's operating it. Some say that he may nevertheless receive the revenue. Others say he may not. Achronim conclude there is no dispute here. This ruling is that one may receive the revenue. The first an arrangement that is inherently permitted, for example, if one leased the bathhouse to the non-Jew for a year or for a month. Here, there is no issue of Sechar Shabbos, because it is part of an inclusive arrangement. The leasing is prohibited only because of Marit Ayin, as explained earlier. Therefore, after the fact, one may accept the payment from the non-Jew. On the other hand, the second ruling is that he may not receive the revenue if the bathhouse is leased day by day. So if it's leased, like this is my own words here, poetic license, if it's leased for a whole year, it can be closed on some Shabbos, so it's not, the non-Jew can close it, doesn't have to be open on Shabbos if it's leased for a long period of time. And it says here, in such a case, that if the non-Jew offers the money of his own volition, the Jew may not accept it as stated earlier. I don't want to get too technical here, but I would say if one gets into such a situation, you ask a Rov. It's not so clear cut, and you know what I mean? It may be allowed, it may not, but always in a case like that, that's could be a gray area. You rather consult people like Rabbi Cohen and Cecil. These are your go-to guys.
Okay.
Rabbi Albach for Gavin. Yeah.
All right, guys, let's hit the Gemara because we've lost a bit of time now. Nice to see you all, well, in a manner of speaking. All right, so now we're hitting a slightly different section. We're going to be going on to the 66 stuff please God, in about 5-6 minutes. But we're still on the last stretch of the 65th stuff before we go on the 66. So basically, if you remember, Rav Ila offered a simple counter challenge to Rav Chanina. So what did he say? Because Rav Chanina said, listen, he brought a Bryce and he said, how was it worded exactly? It basically said if one stole a lamb and it matured into a ram, or if he stole a calf and it matured into an ox, he pays the twofold, fourfold, and fivefold payments according to the animal's value when he stole it. So that was an argument against Rav Ila, who said that there's no fourfold or fivefold payment because when it changes its physical status, the thief acquires it. Now, Rav Ila is saying, well, if you really believe what you're saying, there's a problem because this brisa you're bringing is saying that the penalty payments are made according to the animal's value when the thief stole it. So if it didn't take into account physical change, then why don't you make the thief pay for it at the time of the court date or when it was stolen or sold? because then the animal is going to be worth far more once it has a physical and sexual maturation. I mean, it's a worthy animal now of breeding for animal husbandry, as well as weight for steaks and lamb chops and whatever the case may be. So he said, you actually agreeing with me that physical change affects acquisition, because if not, you would make the penalty payment just like what Rav said at the time when it's assessed in court. And the principle at the time when it was stolen, but the penalties at the court date or when it was sold or slaughtered. So that was Rav Ila's retort to Rav Chanina, which is a good argument. He's saying, how do you explain that? But it never really addressed how Rav Ila would deal with it either. It was a good argument against Rav Chanina. So now we're learning how Rav Ila would deal with it. So basically, in any event, the question raised by Rav Chanina from the Brisa does remain difficult, because if indeed the transformation to a ram or an ox constitutes a change that affects acquisition, why is the thief liable to the fourfold and fivefold payment altogether? Does that make sense? According to Rav Ila's, so Rav Chanina has to answer that, because Rav Ila stated above, the thief should not be liable at all, since it's his own animal that he's slaughtering or selling, because it took a physical change. So now the Gemara is going to clear it up. It brings an answer from Rav Sheshes, who said, Rav Ila will explain whose authorship is reflected in this brisa. It's the brisa is authored by Beis Shammai, who say, now you have the original Hillel and Shammai, which were original great Rabbonim. But then you had Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai, which was the school of Hillel and the school of Shammai, where they learned their teachings from their master. Does that make sense? And the one thing we can learn about Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai is, even though they never agreed on that much, is that it's not like today. It said Beis Hillel's daughters would marry Beis Shammai's sons, and Beis Shammai's sons would marry Beis Hillel's daughters, meaning that they didn't let their arguments get in the way of shidduchim, or from the two of them getting along very well, because that's in essence why Rabbi Akiva lost his students, because each one thought their own opinion was the only opinion, and they weren't able to look at somebody else's opinion as valid. So it's a very, very good lesson that. We generally go again according to Beis Hillel today, because it's the lenient approach, and in today's generation, I don't think we could handle Beis Shammai's level of strictness. In some halachas, we actually compromise and do both. Like, for example, if you see the position of where a mezuzah is put on the wall and the direction it's put in the wall, it's a combination of Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai. And in fact, people are under the misnomer that Beis Hillel is always more lenient than Beis Shammai. I remember reading in Edias, which it was a Gemara, it was a tractate as part of Muzikin, that when a woman goes through her menstrual period, in terms of the checking and the time period and the waiting period, Beis Hillel is actually stricter in that case than Beis Shammai. So it's not altogether clear, but generally Beis Shammai is more strict than Beis Hillel as a rule. Okay, these are things I'm just talking about, they're not in the Gemara. So we learn Rav Sheshes is bringing the opinion that this particular brisa that we learned was authored by Beis Shammai. So you've got to know a little bit of context, and I'm going to explain to you what it means. Beis Shammai held that a stolen article that undergoes a change remains in its place. In other words, it remains the possession of the owner, and the thief does not acquire it at all. Okay, because you cannot acquire something through illicit means. So, for example, there might be a different argument. If you found a lost object, could you acquire it? Is different to breaking the law. Okay, that's going to be a discussion we're going to deal with just now in the Gemara. But in the meantime, Beis Shammai said anything that you've done illegally, the change remains in its place, meaning we don't acknowledge the change that's actually taken place. And the thief does not acquire it. Because it was taught in a brisa, if one gave a harlot wheat kernels as the harlot's payment, and then one made them into flour, or if he gave her olives and then one made them into oil, or if he gave her grapes and then made them into wine. I tell you what I'm going to do, guys. Before I give over this brisa, I think I need to give you guys a little bit of context. Gavin is more familiar with this because Rav Simcha Steinhauer actually brought this up in his shir, the last shir he gave while he was in South Africa. Gavin, you'll recognize this, okay? Is that at the end of the day, it was in Deuteronomy chapter. It was in Deuteronomy chapter 23, verse 19. Deuteronomy is Devarim. Is that right, Kev?
Yeah.
Okay, so basically it says, you shall not bring a harlot's payment or a dog's exchange to the house of Hashem your God for any vow offering. For all of them, for also both of them are an abomination to Hashem your God. So I'm going to repeat this. You shall not bring a harlot's payment. When we say a harlot's payment, the harlot herself, the prostitute got paid from a male suitor, let's call him, and he paid her. Sometimes he pays in cash, but in those days, it wasn't exactly like checkers where people would carry around denominations. He could pay, if he was a butcher, he could give a steak for the month. Okay. Or you could give a baker, he could give her bread for the month or whatever. The exchange could be in lieu of what her services were worth. So her service was worth 200 shekels. He would give her 200 shekels worth of bread. And I'll tell you why that bartering system occurred. When Gavin comes back, I'll tell him.
So, Damon, what they're trying to say here, they're trying to say that's like, it's not clean money, it's not legal money, it's like the same as the thief who kept the lamb and it developed into a ram. It's the same thing. It shouldn't have been his in the first place because he stole it. It's not above board, so to speak.
Exactly. So
they used as sacrifices, like if they used the olives or grapes.
Correct. So you can't be a mafioso and donate 100,000 rand to the shul and get an aliyah if that money is blood money. Exactly. So if it's harlot money, she can't be doing tricks at night and then during the day go there all from. It's a bit difficult. So the reality is that's known as a abomination to Hashem, because you're not allowed to exchange in harlotry. When it uses the term dog's exchange,
I couldn't find any explanation for dog. What did they gave a dog for? What?
I'll explain it to you. So if you sell an animal, or you sell and you get money for it, okay, you don't use the money that you sold a dog for, and something as crass and mundane as that, and use that exact same money in the temple for a vow offering. Because it's just not. It's not. What are you comparing Hashem's offering to? Where's the money come from? So the money's got. And if it's your business, for example, to do that, then you could always exchange the money you earned in lieu of buying an animal to sacrifice or something like that. But it's got to. It can't be the original. So let me just finish a sec. So what we're saying is that as far as this is concerned, don't you remember we did this in Sota last time, Gavin? When Rav Simcha was here on the Sunday.
Yeah.
He quoted this exact verse. Okay? So how does this relate to Beis Shammai? Beis Shammai is basically saying that any item that is treif, you cannot acquire it and use it or benefit from it. In other words, a harlot cannot benefit from the money by almost um, by almost seeing its changed state. So I'm going to explain to you what that means compared to Beis Hillel. Okay, but before we get there, Kev, you had a question.
Yeah, but a dog, what happens to the guy's a dog breeder? That's how he makes his living, and he sells, and that's his panosa.
So
he sells dogs.
I think that might be a little bit different. If that's his panosa, he might have to exchange it for money and let it change hands. You know what I mean? On an exchange. In other words, take the 200 Rand, buy a cold drink, and then get fresh money. That's
okay. Like
or it might be an exception because it's not considered disrespectful, since that's how he's earned his living. It's not a once-off case of selling a dog. So Beis Shammai basically said that even if a physical change acquires a object, the very fact that it is an abomination to Hashem, that involved in that act, is a problem, and we're going to apply to the law of the thief. I'm waiting for Gavin to come back. Okay, so no problem, Gavin, no problem. I just want you to be here because this is interesting. If you need to get something to eat, we can wait for you. But yeah, I promise you, there's no pressure from my end, honestly.
It's finished now.
Okay, but there's no issue at all. So, all right. So let me just tell you what's going on here, right? So basically, Beis Shammai said that if one gave a prostitute wheat kernels as her payment, and then one made flour, or if a male suitor paid her in olives, and then she made it into olive oil, or if he gave her grapes, okay, and she made it into wine, it's still prohibited for an offering. Okay, that's according to Beis Shammai, because Beis Shammai says a change does not affect acquisition if it's through illicit gains or through an abomination. Beis Hillel said it's acceptable. So let's see the two opinions. Beis Hillel said, okay, look, even a prostitute, it's like not everybody's perfect. She chose her living like that, but maybe she made a vow and wishes to break the vow, and she's also, in certain ways, goes to the mikveh, whatever she does, and nobody's perfect. But that original form of that money or that article is an abomination to Hashem, because that very prohibition is what she's using to dedicate to Hashem. That exact payment for a prohibited act is what she's using to dedicate to Hashem. So if she gets grain and gives that as an offering to Hashem, but she got it through prostitution, and Hashem said no prostitution, you can't do that. So Beis Hillel said what she needs to do then is make it into bread. And when it's made into bread, it no longer resembles the original wheat. And therefore that change affects acquisition. Now she can take that bread and take it to the temple. Now, if she had olives and made olive oil, it doesn't resemble olives anymore, and then she can use that olive oil to take it to the temple. I'm not asking you to go off the screen. I'm asking you, do you understand what I'm saying? I like seeing you.
So, Damon, just repeat that about the bread. How did why the bread's acceptable?
Because
can you just go say that again?
Arthur there. Arthur's turned off the screen now. All I said is I didn't want him to turn off the screen. I just asked if he...
He's turning the screen because he doesn't want to be on camera.
Well, but why not?
He's helping me with the cooking. She doesn't want to be on camera, but okay.
But we want to see that you know what's going on. I've seen Adina before.
I don't know what's going on. It's just an illusion.
So what we're saying, Kev, is that you cannot go to the casino, right? Gambling is like prohibited on a professional level. Win money and then go and buy things at the shul with that money. So according to Beis Hillel, if you go there and then you change the money in some way, it's indirect, it doesn't resemble the original thing, and then it is acceptable. Beis Shammai said not. So Beis Shammai said it doesn't matter if you turn grain into bread. Doesn't matter if you turn olives into olive oil or grapes into wine. If it came from an illicit act, no matter how it changes form, you are prohibited to use it. So Rav Sheshes is saying that's exactly an answer to why there's a fourfold and fivefold payment necessary. Because even if change affects acquisition, okay, you still don't get rewarded by not paying the penalties because you did an illicit act. Doesn't matter if the animal didn't resemble anything where at court you couldn't identify it. Because a change generally acquires a physical change does enact acquisition, but not if that original acquisition was through illegal means or prohibited means. Beis Hillel says it's fine. In other words, he's not condoning the illicit act, but he said it's not quite the same slap in the face if it's not physically recognizable by anybody to be the original article. He's not recommending it. He's just saying it's not outright prohibited. Because what's going to happen, according maybe to Beis Hillel, I don't know, is that if you say to a Yid, well, you can't do this now and you can't do that, a Yid might lose all interest in Torah. So he's saying, listen, it's not ideal, but at least make some sort of a change so it's not disrespectful. You know, you need to work on getting rid of that prostitution habit of yours. Okay, but in the meantime, you genuinely took a vow, you're sorry about that, and you're working on yourself. Beis Shammai said, don't play games, you can change it as much as you want. You did an illicit act. You can't affect acquisition. So too, just like a thief that stole something, he can't now suddenly says he benefits from the change and doesn't make the twofold, fourfold, or fivefold payment because that article took physical change.
So it's b'di'evet. Beis Hillel says b'di'evet situation. It was a lechatchila.
No, Beis Hillel doesn't say b'di'evet. He doesn't say after the fact if you kept it in the same state you can use it. He said before the b'di'evet you have to change. But b'di'evet, you've committed the act, but now it still has to make a physical change in order for the harlot to acquire it in an allowed manner.
So lechatchila then, after it's changed form.
After it's changed form, yeah, use English.
It's still not ideal. He says it's still not ideal, but it's better than nothing. Yes.
Exactly. Okay. All right. So that obviously explains a lot. Okay, now I'm sure a light went on as far as that's concerned. So it was taught. So basically, Rav Yosef is now trying to have a resolution between Beis Hillel's opinion and Beis Shammai's opinion. And Rav Yosef said in resolution of these conflicting braisot, Gurion of Asperk taught in a brisa that states regarding this case, Beis Shammai prohibit the flour, oil, and wine for offerings, whereas Beis Hillel permit them for offerings. Again, Beis Shammai said, if you took wheat, and you made it flour, Gavin, if you took olives and made olive oil, and you took grapes and you made it wine, it's prohibited. It's still caused from the same act. Beis Hillel said that physical change is now a form of acquisition and permits them full use for offerings. Does that make sense? So the conflict between the two brises is explained. Okay? So in other words, Beis Shammai holds that a change remains in its place, meaning although the original article is materially changed, it's still considered, even from a monetary perspective, to be the original article. Accordingly, says Rav Sheshes, Rav Illa will say that the brisa regarding the lamb that became a ram is authored by Beis Shammai. Okay, the one that, and although the change from a lamb to a ram is indeed significant, because the thief can't be held liable for slaughtering or selling the ram, Beis Shammai who wrote this brisa, holds that it's still considered, even monetarily, to be the original stolen article. So he's saying, Rav Illa, that basically Rav Chanina bought a brisa that was authored by Beis Shammai. You get it, guys? And the act of theft can't gain acquisition. Do you get it?
It's the strict opinion. He goes by stricter, which is Beis Shammai.
Yes. So let's just learn the last part. So now we want to see how they get their reasoning. What's the reason Beis Shammai for prohibiting them for offerings even after they've undergone a material change? Because, in other words, he's got his logic, but it has to be based on biblical or Chumash sources. So basically, there's in Deuteronomy, where I read chapter 23, verse 19, there's the word also. Okay. It says, "You shall not bring a harlot's payment or a dog's exchange to the house of Hashem your God for any vow offering, for also both of them are an abomination to Hashem your God." So what's happening here is that term also that's being used is saying that both of them are abomination. Both the original form and the changed form come from the same illicit act, and therefore it's expounded to include something else, and that is that changes, no matter what changed form takes place, it includes their changed forms. Does that make sense? The term also means the original state it was in is prohibited, and also their changed form is prohibited, because they're all from illicit gains. Now, how does Beis Hillel rule that it's okay? Beis Hillel holds that the term them, okay? Now, if you look at it, it says, and also both of them are an abomination to Hashem. The term haim, which uses the word shenehem, both of them, says that only them themselves, in other words, the original state at which the harlot got paid, or the dog's exchange, in the original, are prohibited, but not their changed forms. You get what I'm saying? So them, in other words, the way that they were paid, that original state, prohibited. The changed forms is no longer the term them. It's a different form now. So how does Beis Shammai do what does he do with the term them? How does he explain it? Haim. So he says it comes to teach that the prohibition extends only to them, but not their offspring. Meaning, it's for the harlot itself. If she gets paid in steak or wheat or whatever it is, or if it changes forms, it doesn't matter if it changed forms. All of those are prohibited. But those things are prohibited, but not the result of it. Let me give you an example. Say she got paid by a butcher in terms of an animal, a living animal, like a chicken, for example, right? And that chicken gave an egg. Now that egg afterwards is okay, because it's not part of the original animal. Or a pregnant animal was given as a harlot's payment. The fetus after the birth may be put on the altar. Does that make sense, guys? So in other words, Beis Shammai is saying that yes, them and their change forms are also prohibited, but the term them is not including the offspring of that which is prohibited. So that's okay. So then the question to Beis Hillel is, if the term then is needed to teach that the offspring are permitted, as Beis Shammai pointed out, how does Beis Hillel derive at the term that the changed forms are permitted? Because Beis Shammai is saying, yes, the offspring are allowed, but not the changed forms. So Beis Hillel say to you, look, we learn two things from the word shenehem. The first thing we learn is that the prohibition applies only to them, the original way that the harlot got paid. So if it was wheat, if she changed it into flour, that's fine, etc., but not their changed forms. In other words, their changed forms are allowed. and it applies only to the original way that she got paid, but not to their offspring. So he says you can learn both from that. Now, according to Shammai, he said that the word also is written, which means both the original forms that she was paid, as well as the changed forms of what she did to alter it, like olives into olive oils, grapes into wine, and wheat into flour, is also prohibited. Anything coming from an illicit act, where even if a changed physical form is prohibited. So it's saying to Beis Hillel, what do you do with that word also? And since Beis Hillel excluded both changed forms and offspring from the prohibition based on the term then, how do they account for the inclusionary term also, which Beis Shammai used to include the changed form in prohibition? So the Gemara concedes. It says, look, this is difficult for Beis Hillel, not for Beis Hillel himself, because in other words, it's not a refutation of Beis Hillel's position. All it's saying is we don't know how he would answer it today. We don't know. We're not quite sure. He definitely could, but we just don't know how. That's all. We've got 7 minutes left, guys. Let's just continue. We're making good progress. So now we've started Rav Illa and Rav Chanina's interpretation of the Brice's ruling, that a thief who slaughters or sells the stolen animal after it matures, from a lamb or a calf into a ram or ox, pays the fourfold and the fivefold payment according to its value at the time of the theft. So the Gemara is asking us, so far, Rav Illa and Rav Chanina do not disagree, except insofar as this master, Rav Illa, holds that the change from a lamb to a calf or ram to an ox, any sort of change, Rav Illa says, affects acquisition of the animal for a thief, because he's obviously not holding like Beis Shammai. Whereas this master, Rav Chanina, holds, according to Beis Shammai, that the change from the lamb to the calf does not affect acquisition, because anything from an illicit activity like prostitution or theft, there can be no acquisition through an illegal act. Okay? So in that way they disagree. But with respect to the assessment of the payment, all agree that the thief pays the twofold, fourfold, and fivefold payment in accordance with the stolen animal's original value at the time of theft. Okay. So they don't really, guys, let me just fix this up, is that Rav Illa holds that there's no four or fivefold payment. But he does say to Rav Chanina, look, there is this price, and I'll give you that. According to Beis Shammai, we agree that the thief does not acquire it with a physical change. But then you have to take account that the physical change is strong enough that you don't pay on that change, and you pay the penalty as well as the principal at the time the animal was stolen. Okay? He pays the twofold payment, the fourfold and the fivefold according to the animal's value at the time that he stole it. So let's say that this brisa is a refutation of Rav's ruling. Because what did Rav say? Rav said a thief pays for the principal according to the stolen article's value when he stole it. But guys, do you remember he said, and for the twofold, fourfold, and fivefold payment, according to the stolen article's value when he is sued in court. So in other words, now that he's sued in court and that the animal has now undergone weight gain and is worth more, that's when you paid. So it seems that Rav Illa, even if he had to concede to Rav Chanina's brisa, both would agree that the penalties would occur at the time of the theft, not when he's sued in court. So it looks like a refutation of Rav, but it's not. Because the Gemara says Rav said, when the thief pays for the twofold, fourfold, or fivefold payment with lambs, he pays according to what the animal was originally at the time of the theft. But when he pays with cash, he pays according to what the animal is now. I'm going to repeat this. Rav said that if the thief pays the penalty payments with lambs, he pays according to what the animal's worth originally at the time of theft. But when he pays with cash, he pays according to what the animal is worth now. Because Rav holds that when a thief pays his multiple penalties, by paying a number of lambs similar to the lamb he stole, he's fulfilled the biblical commandment, right? Because it says that basically for sheep in the place of a sheep that he stole. So it means that if you're paying with the sheep, like the sheep you stole, you get the benefit to pay the lower fee at the time of the theft. But if you're paying in cash or the equivalent, you have to pay for what the animal is worth now. So it doesn't mean that Rav Chanin and Rav Ila would say it's a contradiction to Rav, according to the payment method. Because when the thief pays through some other means, Rav's got an exposition, revived the principle back to the original state, but not the multiple penalty to be as it was when he stole it. Okay, so it's much better to pay it back in lambs. So Rav stated that his principle concerning payment made in cash, for example, when paying for lambs, that the original value is only sufficient if you're paying with lambs. But if you're paying with cash or any other means, you have to pay the value at the time of the court date at which we work out when the animal was sold or slaughtered. Okay, so the Bryce and the discussion of Rav Chanin and Rav Ila don't pose a contradiction to Rav, because they deal with cases where payment was made in lambs rather than in cash. Does that make sense? And then just one thing, Rav Ila, even though he concedes to Rav Chanina, he says, look, the kefil payment isn't a fourfold or fivefold. It's actually a twofold, even for a lamb or a ox. Because even if you have to pay double, you pay at the time that you stole it. That was one opinion. There was another opinion that he says, all right, we'll concede with your brasa for the 4 or 5-fold if you're going according to base Shammai, but then it's at the time when you stole it. But I still hold by the base Hillel opinion that the acquisition counts if the physical change took place, and therefore there's no penalty payment, because when the acquisition took place, the thief owns the animal. He only has to make the financial restitution for the penalty, but the 4 or 5-fold payment doesn't count at all. He just pays the animal principal and another one for the penalty, which is a twofold. All right, guys, I'm done.
Damon, just one quick question. What does it mean at the time of theft? Does it mean when they established that some guy stole? Is that at the time of theft?
Absolutely.
What is that actually?
Absolutely. In other
when
words,
they figured out who was they worked out who the thief was. Is that the time of theft?
No. When the article was stolen, even if the case is a year later, the day of the theft is the day of a car accident, for example. Even if the case is a year later, it's the day of the accident when 2 litigants appear.
The actual day that it took place.
Yes, absolutely. So which means if the animal was worth less,